As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power.
Our worst fears have now come true, and all our warnings have proved tragically accurate. President Putin of Russia has unleashed war in our European continent. He's attacked a friendly country without any provocation and without any credible excuse. Ukraine is a country that for decades has enjoyed freedom and democracy and the right to choose its own destiny. We and the world cannot allow that freedom just to be snuffed out. We cannot and will not just look away.
The Soviet Union had collapsed, and as it splintered, a number of new nations emerged. Ukraine was one of the largest. Its population was 52 million. It was 1,200 kilometres from east to west, and with that land came a huge farming sector, worth over $20 billion now, or close to £15 billion. And as democracy moved east, this was a moment of optimism. In 1991, Ukrainians celebrated their first election. The US called it momentous. One voter described a flowering of our soul. But for all the enthusiasm, democracy couldn't change Ukraine's geography or its history. To the east was Russia. To the west was Poland, Slovakia and Hungary. All three had communist past. By 2004, all three had joined the European Union. Being pro-Russia or pro-Europe became a fundamental dividing line in Ukrainian politics, and months later, we saw how. Amidst allegations of electoral fraud, what became known as the Orange Revolution began, and two men were the focus. Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Russia and who'd initially been declared the winner, and Viktor Yushchenko, here on the right, who was pro-Euro and would become president after a new vote. And while the outcome of that election was settled, relations with Russia were not. In 2010, there was a further twist. Yanukovych was re-elected, and then in 2013, he would take a decision with huge ramifications. Chris Morris reported at the time.
As EU leaders arrived for the Eastern Partnership Summit, something was missing. The centrepiece was supposed to have been the signing of an association agreement with Ukraine.
But it didn't happen. Under pressure from Russia, Yanukovych walked away from that deal with the EU, and another revolution would begin. There were weeks of protests and crackdowns, and in the end, Yanukovych would flee this country estate just outside Kiev and head for Russia. Watching from Moscow was Vladimir Putin. This was his cue to act. First, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. It's a peninsula on the Black Sea. Weeks later, pro-Russia rebels seized two regions in the east of Ukraine. Russia already divided Ukrainian politics. Now Putin was dividing the country itself. But the turn towards the West that frustrated him then remains now. One recent poll shows 68% of Ukrainians are in favour of joining the EU. Putin, though, sees Russians and Ukrainians as one people, a single whole. He says Ukraine is ancient Russian soil. That perception may explain this invasion today, but perhaps there's something else too. The 90s brought a surge of democratic optimism. To Ukraine's current president, this invasion is showing us what Putin thinks of that.
Putin started a war against Ukraine, against the whole democratic world. He wants to destroy my country. He wants to destroy our country. Everything we've been building, everything we live for.
That effort to build a nation began as Ukraine emerged from the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Today, as Russia invades, Ukrainians are seeing the extent of Putin's resentment of what happened then and what's happened since.
Now, the center of the greatest crisis in Europe since the Second World War is, of course, one man, President Vladimir Putin. In an impassioned address to the nation on Monday, he set out in 7,500 rather rambling words his version of this region's history. It is that reading of history which motivates and, he claims, justifies his actions in Ukraine. Today is Defender of the Fatherland Day in Russia, and the man who has claimed that mantle for over 2 decades as president came to pay his respects at Moscow's much-visited tomb of the unknown soldier this morning. The reason why Europe is now on the brink of war is largely because of one man's view of Russian history and his autocratic power to do something about it, alone with the demons that he wants to slay. Vladimir Putin, the former KGB agent, used to like portraying himself as a man of action, in touch with nature, who went after fish, not countries. But Mr. Putin has evolved from this. In later life, he's retreated into a cocoon made of COVID, distrust and faith. He prefers his own company, even in church. Take this year's televised midnight mass in Moscow. While the congregation celebrated in the Christ the Saviour Cathedral, Putin was all alone with his maker, looking somber and a little uncomfortable. Vladimir Putin sees the Orthodox Church as the spiritual mantle of Greater Russia, the very reason for its birth. He was the driving force behind the creation of this giant statue at the gates of the Kremlin in 2016. Prince, then Saint Vladimir, his namesake, converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988. This was the foundation of ancient Russia, and he was its first ruler, its first protector of the fatherland. Except it all took place in Kyiv, where there is also a statue of the same saint erected 170 years ago. But here they call him Volodymyr, and they see him as the founder of the Ukrainian nation. His bones and the bones of many of Russia's other great saints are buried in the churches and monasteries of Kyiv. If Vladimir Putin were ever to enter the city as the conqueror, expect him to make a beeline for these places. This is his Temple Mount. In his view, there can be no reconstitution of Great Russia without its inclusion. How do we know that? Because he told us so on Monday on television.
Еще раз подчеркну, что Украина для нас это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства. Распад исторической.
This was a stream of consciousness version of a 5,000-word essay that he wrote last summer as Putin, the amateur historian. And there's the rub. Rival versions of the same history. Putin told us again that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a disaster because it allowed Ukraine to break away, diminishing Russia and its historic claim to be a nation anchored in Europe. But that's not how the people of Ukraine see it. They've been defending their right to see the collapse of the Soviet Union as liberation from Moscow's tyranny. That is their version of the past, and they're prepared to pay for it in blood. It is an argument about rival interpretations of history, a clash of myths that threatens to become a clash of armies poised in the snow.
Vladimir Putin grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War. In 1945, the US, the UK and the Soviet Union met to shape the new world. 7 years on, he was born in what was then Leningrad and is now St. Petersburg. By the 70s, Putin had studied law and then joined the Russian Secret Service, the KGB. At this time, the Soviet Union's influence reached across the communist nations of Eastern Europe. And in the 80s, Putin was posted to Dresden in East Germany. From there, he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. This was a visceral example of people power. To Putin, though, the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And while that demise was negotiated, Putin was heading home to find a place for himself in the new Russia. Russia's president in the 90s, Boris Yeltsin, would help him do that. He made Putin head of the security services. Then Putin was elected prime minister. Then, in 1999, Yeltsin resigned. Putin was president. And his way of operating was clear from the start.
Tightening the grip over media was one of the first things that he did. And also the lack of genuine opposition, because his critics either have been in exile or dead or facing prosecution.
Putin's focus on his own power and wealth was relentless. By 2008, when his 2 terms were up, Dmitry Medvedev replaced him as president. But Putin became prime minister, and everyone knew who was in charge. By 2012, he was back as president again. Putin's indifference to democracy is matched by his view of sovereignty. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia to support separatists. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. It supported separatists in eastern Ukraine. And in 2018, a former Russian Secret Service operative was poisoned in Salisbury. The UK says Russian intelligence was responsible. To Putin, the rules are for him to make. He said as much himself.
I hope no one will cross Russia's red line, but in each case we are the ones who will decide where the red line is.
And Russia's right to decide roots back to Putin's view of what he's seen in his lifetime. In 2015, he addressed the UN and said, instead of the triumph of democracy and progress, we got violence, poverty, and social disaster. Nobody cares a bit about human rights. Putin's contempt was directed at Western democracy. We've seen, though, how little he cares for democracy in Russia and Ukraine. Despite this, years earlier, the West talked of trusting him.
I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
We're getting a sense of it too this week, as we did a few years ago when Putin spoke of his childhood, telling us 50 years ago the Leningrad street taught me a rule. If a fight is inevitable, you have to throw the first punch. There was nothing inevitable about this week, but Ukraine has felt that first punch. A punch Putin justifies in his country's interests, but which very much serve his. And as we've watched the violence, I think back to that criticism of the West, at the UN in 2015. Putin said, I'm urged to ask those who created this situation.
If there is infrastructure, if United States and NATO missile systems appear in Ukraine, it will reduce their flight time to Moscow from 7 to 10 minutes, and in the case of deployment of hypersonic weapons to 5 minutes.
President Putin speaking there. Well, let's get some more analysis from our International Affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Armin, welcome to the studio. What was the military infrastructure that President Putin was talking about just there?
Well, there's no NATO base as such in Ukraine because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but cooperation between Ukraine and NATO has intensified. There was an important meeting, for example, in late October, which discussed technology transfer, among other things. NATO members have also increased their presence in the Black Sea, which has put more pressure on Russia. And interestingly, also, Ukraine has acquired military help from Turkey, including drones, which were used to devastating effect in the Nagorno-Karabakh war a year ago. Turkey, of course, being a NATO member itself, and the US since 2014 has provided various forms of aid to Ukraine and various know-how which Ukraine now has that it didn't have in 2014 when that conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine. So I think the backdrop to Putin's comments there is this shifting military balance between Russia and Ukraine as a result of this help that Ukraine has got from NATO particularly, and of course Russia still has by far a bigger army than Ukraine. But, as I said, Ukraine does now have this technology and know-how, which is changing the balance a bit now.
Okay, are we hearing anything from Ukraine itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these military activities by Russia for President Zelensky of Ukraine simply underline, as far as he's concerned, the urgency for Ukraine to join NATO and the European Union. And in his latest comments, he was pushing back against the idea that is sometimes expressed by national security doves in Europe and in the US that, the West should be careful, should take things slowly, not rush into offering Ukraine membership of NATO and the European Union. Let's take a listen now to President Zelensky.
We cannot accept the theory that is now very popular about Ukraine joining the European Union in 30 years and joining NATO sometimes in about 50 years. It demotivates us and it slows us down.
So I think NATO now is in a slightly tricky position. On the one hand, there is pressure now building on NATO to speed up that process, to give Ukraine a membership action plan. That's obviously pressure is being led by President Zelensky, but not only by him, also by what is known as the Lublin Triangle, which is Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland. That group is now essentially ramping up those same efforts in response to what both Russia and Belarus are doing in the neighborhood. So NATO, of course, is well aware that not only did it offer Ukraine the possibility of NATO membership as far back as 2008 at the NATO summit, but it reiterated that possibility at the June summit, the NATO summit in June of this year. So that's at least twice that NATO has affirmed this path towards NATO membership for Ukraine. Ukraine is now saying, well, where are the concrete steps to actually bring us into European Euro-Atlantic integration? On the other hand, the West does also have this dependency on Russia and Russian gas during the winter, when Russian gas is obviously needed to heat European homes. So it is a bit of a dilemma for the West in that sense.
The scenes unfolding in the streets and fields of Ukraine are nothing short of a tragedy. Brave young soldiers and innocent civilians are being cut down. Tanks are rumbling through towns and cities, missiles raining indiscriminately from the skies. It's a generation or more since we witnessed such bloodshed in Europe. We hoped we would never have to see such sights again. The people of the United Kingdom stand with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters in the face of this unjustifiable assault on your homeland. We salute the fierce bravery and patriotism of your government, your military, and your people. I'm in close contact with President Zelensky. And as Prime Minister, I speak for us all in the United Kingdom when I say once again, Slava Ukraini. This is a tragedy for Ukraine, and so too it is a tragedy for Russia. Like Ukraine, Russia is a great country with a rich history and a proud people. Like Ukraine, Russia's poets and artists and authors have shaped our culture, and Russia's soldiers fought so bravely with us in the struggle against fascism. But Putin's actions are leading to complete isolation for Russia, shunned by the rest of the international community, hit by immense economic sanctions, and facing a needless and bloody war that is already costing countless lives, from innocent Ukrainians to your Russian soldiers who will never see their families again. And to my Russian friends, я не верю, что эта война от вашего имени. This crisis, this tragedy, can and must come to an end. Тому що світу потрібна вільна та суверенна Україна. Slava Ukraini!